Years ago, fear took hold of the people of Moline, Illinois. News of a giant beaver began to circulate. Someone claimed to see it tearing up the trees in the city park. It's as big as a Volkswagen, one man said. That giant beaver was finally caught, and when the live trap was pulled up out of the ditch in the city park, the beaver that had terrorized people was found to weigh 40 pounds and measured less than 3 feet long. Now, there might have been justification for such fear, for giant beavers actually did live in the Illinois area before the Ice Age. And in fact, their remains have been found digging in the dirt throughout the state in a few different places. The Illinois State Museum has a giant beaver skull and a partial jaw on display. Here's a picture of it compared to a modern day beaver, and you can see the size difference. That ancient beaver skull is so much larger than that of the modern day one. And if you look at the jaw of that prehistoric beaver, you see that tusk-like tooth on it, and it apparently was a very intimidating animal. The museum says that the prehistoric beaver was the largest rodent to have ever lived in North America. It could reach a length of 8 feet and weigh as much as 275 pounds, the size of a large black bear. Some people around Moline had feared that some of those giant beavers had somehow survived the Ice Age and now were back and they were hungry. And after they had finished off all the trees in Moline, maybe they would start eating the houses there. It was a crisis in the minds of some until the giant was caught. That hysteria inspired a song written by an area resident named Michael Herman, who is a bit of do-it-yourself kind of a guy and writes a few songs. He's not a professional, but the opening lyrics of his song read this way: "On the shores of the old Mississippi stood a town that became the cuisine of a giant so rare none will ever compare to the beaver that ate Moline." Most stories of horrible creatures are told upon Halloween. Yarns of fear and despair, but none will compare to the beaver that ate Moline. The story underscores the point that it is easy for fearful people to see giants where none exist. That's what fear does to us. It plays upon our anxieties and employs our imagination and makes monsters out of a 40-pound mammal. When we face a crisis, fear can take over. This morning we're going to look at a crisis faced by David before he became king of Israel. We will see how fear led him initially, but then eventually he leaned on his faith and it made all the difference. It gave him the courage he needed to face his future crises. I've entitled the sermon based upon that fact, Finding Courage in Crises. Crises, the plural form of crisis, because throughout our lifetime we will face many crises. It's just a fact of life that there are going to be a lot of traumatic experiences that will come into our lives. A lot of things that we will face that will be difficult for us to deal with. Things beyond perhaps our ability, our strength. We will suffer many crises. Crises are fearful times, often because the situation is bleak and there isn't anything that we can do to affect the outcome. Sometimes crises are fearful because we fear the pain or the anguish or the sorrow we know will accompany them. If the affliction we suffer is dire enough, we are afraid even to hope. For if we hope for a positive outcome, and that doesn't happen, instead our worst fears are realized, we understand that we are merely setting ourselves up for more pain and greater disappointment. And so it's easier just to accept the crisis and the affliction that we're suffering and just deal with it and accept it as it is. But that's not the kind of people we are. Christians aren't let's just wallow in our misery kind of people. We are hope for the best kind of people. We are heal the sick kind of people. We are raised from the dead kind of people. Some followers of Jesus have a crisis of faith in crises times. God didn't do enough for them, providing them the miracle they hoped for, the one they prayed passionately for such a long period of time. And so they begin to question. They question God's love. They question His goodness. They question His power. Maybe they question whether God even answers prayer anymore. They don't trust God based upon who He is. They trust God based upon what He has done for them lately, or has not done for them. Our family is suffering through a crisis. It is a life and death issue. We are praying for a miracle. A miracle is the only hope we have. I have prayed more for this than I have prayed for anything else. What if God doesn't answer that prayer? Will we give up on Him? If He doesn't come through for me when I need Him most, and He is no God to me, well, that would be a pretty self-serving kind of faith, wouldn't it? A faith that expects God to give us what we need, and if He doesn't, then we're out, is a shallow faith. It will hurt if God doesn't answer our prayer. But we know that if He does not provide the help we seek, He will provide the help we need. And that depth of faith will give us the courage to face our crisis. Crises are dangerous because they can often distort discernment. That is, they can make us think unwisely. They can cause us to make poor choices. Even for people of faith, that is a danger. Most of you are familiar enough with King David of the Old Testament times, David, the writer of the Psalms, that you know much of his story. You remember him as a boyhood hero, the teenager who fought against the giant Goliath, this warrior who intimidated all the other soldiers in Israel's army, the warrior who was armed with weapons that most people couldn't even wield. And here was David as a young teenager with a slingshot facing him in man-to-man, man-to-boy combat. What a crisis situation, and yet he conquered that and rose above it. As a result of that, he was appointed general of the army of Israel. He led Israel's troops to war after war against the Philistines, putting himself at danger. It was a whole new set of crises. In fact, by the time he reached age 20, David had experienced many crises. He was completely capable as a general despite his age, and he was successful. As a result, his popularity rose. Women sang songs about him. He became even more popular than King Saul, and that set forth a whole new series of crises. Saul was jealous of David's popularity. On 3 occasions, he tried to kill David, throwing a spear at him, but David dodged each time and survived. Finally, King Saul sent armed guards to his house to assassinate him, and David left the city. He left the nation, and he ended up in an enemy city, the city of Gath. I think we're having problems with this microphone here. Why don't you put me on the pulpit mic, and I'll just stay put here. Thank you. All right. David ended up going to the enemy territory, the Philistine Empire. We read, for instance, in 1 Samuel chapter 21, verse 10, that day David fled from Saul and went to Achish, king of Gath. Probably not a wise decision on David's part. He should have trusted God. He knew that God had appointed him to be the next king over Israel. He should have trusted that God would protect him despite Saul's attempts to assassinate him. He should have trusted that maybe God would have changed Saul's heart, that he would be safe. But instead, he went out on his own instead of placing faith in God, going to this enemy nation. Maybe he thought the enemy of my enemy will be my friend, that he would be accepted there. But he was not. Maybe he thought if he went there and just kind of laid low that no one would recognize him. But that was not the case either. We read in 1 Samuel 21, verse 11, "But the servants of Achish said to him, 'Isn't this David? Isn't he the one they sing about? Saul has slain his thousands, but David has slain his tens of thousands.'" During this time of his suffering in the nation of Philistia, David wrote Psalm 56. In that psalm, he wrote about his fears. If we look at the superscript of that psalm, we see it is a psalm of David for the director of music when the Philistines had seized him in Gath. And I've listed there verses 1 and 6 as just examples of the fear that he felt while he was there in danger. "Be merciful to me, my God, for my enemies are in hot pursuit. All day long they press their attack. They conspire, they lurk, they watch my steps, hoping to take my life." In 1 Samuel 21 again, verses 12 and 13, we read of David's fear once he was recognized as the general from the enemy army. David took their words to heart and was very much afraid of Achish, king of Gath. So he pretended to be insane in their presence. And while he was in their hands, he acted like a madman. David was captured. He was held against his will. He was afraid for his life, and so he pretended to be insane. But what was he thinking? Going to Gath in the first place. It was a major city in the land of the Philistines. They were the enemies of Israel. There was constant battle between the two nations. The Philistines had won most of those battles and oppressed Israel until the time of David. He was a great military leader because God was powerfully with him. He was so successful in battle against the Philistines that the women of Israel sang, "David has killed tens of thousands." It was the #1 song played on Israeli radio at the time. The Philistines had turned in across the border and heard that song played over and over. They knew it was their soldiers that David had killed by the tens of thousands. He was #1 on their most wanted list. But that's where David went when he fled from Saul. What was he thinking? And remember that giant he had killed as a teenager? Goliath? The Philistine champion, the greatest warrior ever born in that nation? Guess what Goliath's hometown had been? It was Gath, where David had gone. He had killed their hero, and then 2 years later went to that man's hometown. What was he thinking? I graduated from Lakewood High School near Newark, Ohio. My junior and senior years, I dated a girl from Heath High School, a rival school in our conference. She was the head cheerleader and prom queen and very popular. Some of the guys in that school didn't like me because I took one of their finest young ladies out of circulation. Senior year, our football team went into Heath Stadium and beat them mercilessly. There was a lot of tension in the air. A few on-field skirmishes had fueled anger among the fans. Taunts were made. Emotions ran hot. After the game, my girlfriend wanted to go out. She wanted us to go to the after-school hangout for Heath students. We parked the car and walked in front of all those windows on the front of Frisch's restaurant, which still sits on Route 79 in Heath. I was wearing my Lakewood varsity jacket, and through the windows, I saw a lot of angry looks directed at me. What was I thinking? One of the Heath High School cross-country runners came out of the restaurant. He was a friend of mine. He intercepted us and said, "You can't go in there. They're planning to gang up on you." Now I was stuck. Everyone in the restaurant was watching as we were having this conversation. If I left now, they would jeer me for being a coward. If I walked in, I would probably get jumped. My girlfriend tried to pull me back to the car, physically trying to pull me. I resisted, and I argued with her about staying. It was an act. I didn't want to stay. I didn't want to go in there, but I had to pretend in order to save my dignity. Dignity, fear. It was a tough choice. But after a couple of minutes of continuing to pretend, I gave in to her and we left. And I lived. That was how David felt in Gath. But what was he thinking? You see, in the fear of the face of his crisis, his discernment was distorted. He didn't think correctly. He reacted to the crisis instead of acting in faith. Oh, his plan worked. We go back to 1 Samuel 21 and read verse 14. Achish the king said to his servants, "Look at the man. He's insane. Why bring him to me?" And then the next several verses tell us that he was kicked out of Gath and David went on his way and he lived. But in the process, David demonstrated a lack of faith. And I think he discredited his God. And I think he lost his dignity as the godly-led leader of Israel's army. It was not his finest hour. There's a point for us in that. God is gracious with us. In our error, we will make mistakes. We might even demonstrate a lack of faith. And God always allows us to come back. There was a second psalm David wrote about this experience in the nation of Philistia. He wrote it after the fact, years later, looking back on that time, recognizing the error that he had made in judgment. And he wrote Psalm 34. Let's read the superscript of that psalm. A psalm of David when he pretended to be insane before Abimelech, who drove him away and he left. I know what you're thinking, Abimelech, but we read in 1 Samuel 21 that it was Achish. They're the same individual. Achish was his name, but Abimelech was the family dynasty. Kind of like the Herods of first century Judaism. There was Herod the Great and Herod the Tetrarch and Herod Antipas. Herod was the family name, the family dynasty. Abimelech was the family dynasty. Achish was his name. It was the same individual. But look at what David wrote after he was able to look back and realize the error that he had made as we read verses 1 through 3. I will extol the Lord at all times. His praise will always be on my lips. I will glory in the Lord. Let the afflicted hear and rejoice. Glorify the Lord with me. Let us exalt his name together. Much different than what we read in Psalm 56 while he was going through that experience. His fear led then, his faith led now. Later in life, David clung to that faith through many other crises that he faced. Let's remember when David fled away from King Saul, left Israel, and went to Gath. He was only maybe 20 years old. He was still learning to trust God. God is patient with us as we grow in our faith, learning to trust him on a deeper level. God is patient with our failures and our impulsiveness. He knows that our crises can distort our discernment and we will err. And we are learning to trust in him. And God is patient with us through that process. But God doesn't eliminate crises from our lives, even though they do distort our discernment and cause some danger to us. He doesn't eliminate them because he knows that crises can also form our faith. It can teach us where to turn, who to look to in our time of need. We are ever growing in our faith. Don't feel badly if you falter as you are growing on your faith journey. You are still learning to walk by faith. God knows that. Decades ago, Fred Musser from Marshallville, Ohio, went off to seminary to become a preaching minister. Before he left, his home minister gave him a little advice. He said, "When my son was small, we often walked together through the fields and the neighboring pasture behind the parsonage. At first, he would hold on to my finger, but when he stumbled, his grip would slip off of my finger and he would fall into the dust or into the snow. I'd stop and help him up, and he would dust himself off, and then he would grab my finger again, this time a little harder than before." He said this occurred frequently until one day my little son got up and he said, "Daddy, I think that if you would hold my hand, I wouldn't fall." The older preacher said, "You know, he still stumbled many times after that, but he never hit the ground again." And then he added, "As you walk with God, learn to let him hold you. You may stumble, but you will never fall." That's the faith which gives us courage in crises. The faith that we have a God who will hold on to us in our weakest moments, in our most tragic times. He is the God David described in Psalm 34:15 when he wrote these words, "The eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, and his ears are attentive to their cry." He is the God we can trust. He is the God who is ever there for us. And then in the rest of chapter 34 of Psalms, David teaches us how to turn to that God when we are in crises. The first thing he teaches us is to seek God in prayer. Let's go to verse 4 of that chapter. "I sought the Lord," David wrote, "and he answered me. He delivered me from all my fears." In the past 3 weeks, I have counseled 2 different individuals through a time of crisis in their life. I told each of them the same thing I have often told others. Part of the homework I gave them was to read through the Psalms and to pray. I told them to read through the Psalms because the Psalms, each of them, are actually prayers that David writes to God. They were made into songs, many of them for worship services later, but they were really prayers. And they teach us to turn to God in our time of need. And they unveil for us the promises of his deliverance when we do. That's why David wrote these words in verse 5 of that chapter. "Those who look to him are radiant. Their faces are never covered with shame." When we seek God, it will bring joy into our lives, not disgrace. And then David gave this personal testimony of that experience in his life in verse 6 when he wrote, "This poor man called, and the Lord heard him. He saved him out of all his troubles." Notice David wrote that God saved him out of his troubles, not from his troubles. We will continue to find ourselves in crises situations. God will not deliver us from experiencing them, but he will deliver us through them. So seek God in prayer. Secondly, David advises us when we find ourselves in crises to turn to God by fearing him and not the crisis. Let's read verse 7. "The angel of the Lord encamps around those who fear him, and he delivers them." That word for fear that we read there about fearing God in verse 7, that's a Hebrew word pronounced Yahweh. Yahweh. It's not the same word that David used when he wrote about fear in verse 4. When he wrote, "He delivered me from all my fears." That's a different word. It's not Yahweh. The Yahweh of verse 7 is a word which means to have a deep respect or a reverence for. It's most often used in connection with our relationship with God, fearing God. It describes a sense of seeing his awe and majesty and power, and recognizing his authority and his holiness. That fear is not about fearing divine punishment, but it's about respecting God in such a deep way that we honor him. The word that David used in verse 4, when we read that he delivers us from our fears, is a different Hebrew word. It's pronounced megura, and it conveys the idea of terror or dread or anxiety. In using those two words in comparison, David tells us that Yahweh protects us from megura. The fear of the Lord protects us from the fear of everything else. And did you notice in verse 7 the unusual promise we were given? The angel of the Lord encamps around those who fear him. He's describing a force of angelic protection that forms a barrier around us in times of crises. This verse was the inspiration for the man by the name of Basil King, who wrote in the book, The Conquest of Fear, "Be bold, and mighty forces will come to your aid." Boldness means deciding to walk on in spite of our fears, knowing that God will send a means to survive the crisis we are in. Maybe that means of survival will be in the form of angelic guardians, like David wrote in verse 7. For we read this in Hebrews 1:14. Can we bring that up? Are not all angels ministering spirits sent to serve those who inherit salvation? Or maybe when you are in crisis, the form of aid that God will provide for you is a strength that you had never experienced before. For we read this in Isaiah 40:29, he gives strength to the weary and increases the power of the weak. Or maybe for you, when you are in a time of crisis, the aid that God will provide for you will be in the form of a friend who will help you carry that burden. Proverbs 17:17 says, "A friend loves at all times, and a brother is born for adversity." There was a friend in my life who epitomized that verse, Proverbs 17:17, for over 40 years. In fact, he once told me, this verse is about us. And he was right. Or at least it was about the role that he played in my life. For he mentored me. He guided me. He taught me faith. He was God's gift to me through my spiritually formative years. And he was God's ongoing gift to me through times of crises when I needed it. For he was always there to encourage me, to pick me up, to be there and be supportive. He passed away about 12 years ago. And I have endeavored to live since that time to be him to someone else. You see, the truth is God provides for us, and sometimes he sends a friend into our lives, or sometimes he sends us into a friend's life. God will always come to our aid in some way. He will provide us the help we need in times of crisis. We must merely trust him. Hang on and trust him, and he will be there for us. There is nothing that can happen to you that will destroy you if you do not want that to happen. God will always provide the necessary resources. Whatever crisis you are facing right now, God is not blind to it. And he has not forgotten you. If you haven't felt his presence or you haven't experienced his aid yet, hang on. It's coming. He is that God. The greatest source of aid that God provided for us meets the greatest crisis in our lives, the crisis of our eternal destiny. God has already provided that through Jesus, who died to be the one to bear our punishment of sin. Amen. And to give us eternal life. And he offers that this morning. And if you would like to accept it, then he wants you to come forward with heart open, arms open, ready to embrace him as your God and Jesus as your Savior. We invite you to come as we stand and sing our invitation.